Okay. Great. So Ryan, will you talk to me about the instrumentation that you were using?
Mm-hmm.
It looked like a tripod with some rusty old stuff on it that you were playing, and I was like, how is he getting these sounds out of this
Nothing actually rusty
stuff?
Yeah, it's an instrument called a daxophone.
A daxophone?
Yeah,
Okay.
it was invented in the 80s by a German guitarist named Hans Reichel.
Okay.
And yeah, it's honestly not different in principle from, you know, putting a ruler on the end of a table and slapping it and making it vibrate to make a tone, which I did as a kid. I don't know if everyone did.
Yeah, my cats do that with the door stops.
Same thing.
The
Yeah,
oing,
yeah, that's
and the cabinets at night.
that is itself a daxophone. Same idea.
Wow. Okay. My cats are musicians.
They are.
I always knew
Cool
it.
ones, I'd say. But yeah, basically the idea is it's a small instrument with a hollow cavity and a contact mic inside, and you put these strips of wood on it, which you call a tongue. And they're made of different types of wood, and every type of wood kind of gives you a different tone, and then the different shapes for the tongues also result in different behaviors.
Yeah, I saw one that had like a flare out, like a flange kind of thing.
Yeah.
What's the, or maybe not flange is the word, I wouldn't know the words, but that flaring out kind of.
That's as good a word
How
for
does
it
it
as I
adjust?
have.
How does
But,
that change the sound? I
Yeah,
mean,
the shape changes a lot of things. It changes the overall like actual pitch register of the instrument, but it also changes across the length of the tongue how pitch ranges break up. It's kind of a lot like your voice, you know, like you can kind of sing so high, and then at some point your voice just kind of like cracks into a lower or higher register. And the daxophone does really similar stuff.
oh, interesting.
Yeah, so depending on, you know, where you're applying pressure to the tongue and where you're bowing or scraping or what have you, you might suddenly jump down 2 octaves or what have you. So every tongue almost makes it a completely different instrument.
Okay.
Some of them are more resonant than others. Some of them are more like dry and kind of whispery. So you tend to have a few nearby so that you can access whatever type of sound seems to make sense in the moment.
Neat. That's neat. So I saw the computers on stage and the things that are feeding into the computers, and you guys mentioned that you created software.
Yes, yeah.
To produce the sounds and to process the sounds. What's the software? Tell me about that. What's its function and what's it?
It's all made in a kind of simple programming language called Max MSP. It's a very accessible thing. It's not very difficult to work with. So I was using one patch, which was essentially like a granular synthesis thing. It's like constantly recording incoming audio into a buffer and saving it, and then using algorithmic processes to play back individual parts of it. It's really good for making like stuttery things, but generally you're taking a stored frame of audio and accessing tiny snippets of it and rearranging them and changing
according
their
to
pitch.
your mathematical
Exactly.
programming
And
orders.
What
commands,
I was doing with that was fairly
Interesting.
simple. I just had a little MIDI controller on stage so that I could kind of use that in transitional moments. We made a program that incorporates those behaviors, but a lot more, for Sarah to use with Mixie. And that software has gone through many more revisions and has more to come yet. Part of its function is to take the very basic data that comes from the trumpet interface, like, you know, it sensors for like valve displacement and hand tension and trumpet like angle, position, such things, and to process that data and format it into something that can be used in kind of like general purpose fashion. And some of it is actually sound generation stuff, which we've been kind of developing for years now, just kind of refining bit by bit to suit our tastes. It used to be, whenever we first made the interface, we were making a new program for every piece that we played or that she played with it, and that got tiresome because it meant that every time a new performance opportunity came up, we had to write kind of a new specialized software to respond to this hardware that we'd made. So what we're using today was a more like general purpose software that has a lot of simple tools in it that can be reconfigured, a lot like a modular synthesizer.
Really
or
neat.
something.
Okay, right,
Yeah,
right.
it's basically like a software modular synthesizer designed to interface with the trumpet.
Really neat.
Yeah.
All right, now I want to get your take on some of the conceptual stuff. Like
Sure.
when you guys come to the, she ran away. She doesn't like my camera. It's okay. I don't blame her. when you guys come to the stage as a collaborator and as an experimental musician, what's your mindset and what are you drawing from and what are you experiencing? You know, that kind of art mind self.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely this kind of primitive state of listening. Sarah talked about Pauline Oliveros. I have kind of a similar set of influences from this kind of school of thought about listening called spectromorphology.
Spectromorphology?
Yeah.
Cool.
Which,
learn a new word.
Yeah, it's a good one.
It's really good. I like long words.
Yeah, it's an idea that kind of came out of early electronic music by Pierre Schaeffer and Michel Chion and other people along those lines. It's more recently adopted and developed by a Norwegian scholar named Lasse Thoresen.
Okay.
But basically, it values a particular type of listening called reduced listening. There are a few different modes of listening according to these various electroacoustic music people.
Okay.
One being indexical listening, which is the kind of listening we perform on a daily basis in order to orient ourselves in the world. So I hear right now that there's a bird over there. I didn't actually need to look to know there was a bird. I could tell where it was, and I knew from prior indices that I had generated in my mind that that is a bird sound. There's another form of listening called semantic listening, which is basically listening for meaning encoded in sound.
Language would fall into that category.
Yeah, and most musical listening actually falls under that category as well.
Okay.
Because
and I'm wondering if coded sounds like sirens, alarms fall into that category?
Those fit as well. So you actually exercise a number of different types of listening when you hear, when you hear an ambulance. You hear the sound itself and you identify it as an ambulance, but you also bring along with that all of these prior associations with what an ambulance means. It means somewhere there's trouble.
Yeah.
Right? Then this third form of listening is reduced listening, which is listening for the sake of the sound itself and not caring about the cause, ignoring the cause, ignoring all of the associations you might have with the sound and just encountering it as a sound.
Is it ignoring or is it removing those associations?
Attempting to not even consider them, essentially.
To allow them to kind of fall away in very much of Zen mindfulness. I mean, we're talking about Zen.
Exactly.
Like a mindfulness technique of witnessing.
Precisely.
Where you're observing the sound instead of being the recipient of the sound.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so again, it's similar to this. Okay, it's similar to this idea of deep listening, where you just kind of like encounter the sound, let it be a sound, and not need it to be anything else necessarily. And part of my performance practice involves attempting to kind of breach into this mindset and approaching sound, and then translating it into essentially like primitive instinctual movement and using that again to produce sound, which then I attempt to encounter in the same way. And ideally it makes this kind of feedback loop where you're producing sound by virtue of your actions and then responding to the same sound. So
you're really engaging. It's like an internal dialogue almost.
Attempting to, yeah.
Like it's an internal. That's really interesting, just on a level of consciousness, like what you're doing with that. That's really interesting. Yeah. Thank you for telling me about
of course.
that.
Anyway, so typically I do that with electronics. I've only just started incorporating the daxophone into things recently, but typically Burnt Dot is a trumpet and modular synthesizer ensemble. And I've just kind of become a bit disillusioned recently with the experience of playing exclusively an electronic instrument and being essentially physically disengaged with the sound.
Right, right.
Something about the actual sensation of like touching the thing that is producing the sound makes a huge difference. Whereas with an electronic instrument, there are speakers off somewhere that are doing that, and you're touching a rigid, kind of cold object.
Yeah. Yeah, I've considered those issues in my own work. Yeah. And just in my experience of music and sound.
Sure.
Which was very visceral as a child. You know, like having my dad had built speakers and was kind of a stereo geek and music geek and guitar player, and he, we could put a record on, my sister and I remember just kind of sitting in front of this speaker that was like 6 feet tall, seemed 6 feet. It was probably 4, but I was little.
Yeah, you're small.
And curling up and just feeling the vibrations move through my body.
Yeah.
And how healing that was. And then later as a teen, ruining my hearing, but standing in front of the amp, at some intense punk industrial show or something, where I'm just getting my head blasted off by vibrations. And then if, as a single parent, being more isolated in the suburbs and having to have a different lifestyle, being divorced from the more frequent experience of live music gives you a much greater appreciation for it, where you're just like, wow, there's something really healing about live music, where you're hearing instruments, you're in the physical presence of music. It's very different than listening to it on headphones.
It definitely is, yeah.
And I think that connects with that, more primal validation of our existence, and especially for those of us who get out into the theories and the consciousness stuff, and we're tripping out on all that stuff and we enjoy it, but there's also that very human need for communication and for connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you guys do it masterfully. You really do.
Thank you.
And that's something that I wanted to address too, is the emotion. My understanding as a student of voice many years ago and as a singer, vocalist, is, the real work, once you've mastered the technique, is the emotion. It's communicating emotion through your voice. And that's why we can have such an intense, resonant response with a singer who is not a classically trained or great singer. A Janis Joplin or Jim Morrison, can just really move us just as much as a Luciano Pavarotti or somebody, So sometimes more so, depending on what's familiar to us. So I'm just curious about your emotional relationship with the music and the concepts, and that connects with the physical that we were just talking about. You want to address? Can you talk about that a little?
I mean, in so many words, I think it's just about kind of simultaneously practicing empathy as you perform.
Interesting, really.
Yeah, there's nothing that I think about beforehand as far as factoring my own personal feelings into a performance. But part of this act of listening and having these instinctual responses to sound is very closely tied to just empathy and being an empathetic person.
Wow. Okay, so is that and I'm thinking, again, Buddhism, and I'm thinking compassion, which is kind of this thing that all the great traditions teach. And is that something that is a part of your music practice to cultivate within yourself kind of as a lifestyle? Or is that something is it more of a sympathetic empathy, a personal empathy, both for yourself and others that you experience or that you bring to the table kind of when you're making music?
I suppose both. I try to be an empathetic person as much as I can. I think that's important.
So you think it's good to be empathetic? Because this is a noise show, buddy.
I shouldn't be talking about this here.
We're tough punk rockers.
Hop the fence. There's a train coming by.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I'm a like-minded person, but yeah.
That's a simple answer, but
neat.
But yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you so much for letting me take your time.